Bio is a prefix that means what? Anybody know? Life. Okay, so taking what we just learned in our lecture on chemistry and applying it to life. Living things like us is a living thing. We have special chemicals that we need. Like what's pictured here on our first page, DNA. One of the very important biomolecules, important to us and other living things as well. This lecture really details the kind of second half of chapter 2, as I told you guys the other day. There's just so much in that chapter, I split it into 2 different lectures. All right, most of the chemicals in our body exist in the form of compounds. We talked about that the other day. And we take those compounds and we can basically divide them into 2 principal classes. Organics, which are more complex, and we'll talk about those here after a bit. Probably you won't even get to, well, we might. And then inorganics. Okay. We'll start with inorganics, which are typically small. And by small, I'm talking 1, 2, 3, 4 atoms in that compound. They lack carbon chains. So there might be carbon in there, but it's not going to be lots and lots of carbon, like what we see with organics. Typically, they're bonded together either ionically, where those ions, remember, are attracted to one another, or covalently, which means that the electrons are shared. Okay. And they cannot be used by cells to perform complicated biological functions. Now, does that mean that they're not important? No, they are important, okay, but they aren't as complex in function as what we'll see with others, the organics. Examples that are important to us will be O2. What do we know O2 as? Just oxygen, right? Oxygen gas, right? Think about how important that is. How long can we survive without oxygen gas? Minutes, right? Okay. You don't breathe oxygen for a few minutes, you're in big trouble. HCl, anybody know what HCl is? Hydrochloric acid. And now if you've ever taken or take a chemistry class, you might deal with hydrochloric acid in the lab. It's a pretty dangerous compound, very, very toxic to, like, if you get in your skin, it can burn the heck out of you. If you even inhale the vapors, it's gonna burn you. What's amazing is we actually produce hydrochloric acid in our stomach, and it helps digest proteins. And you feel that burning sensation. You ever get gastric reflux or heartburn, or if you ever throw up, you feel that super, super burning sensation. Well, that's because of the hydrochloric acid that should not go up into our esophagus. Okay. The CO2 that we produce when we make ATP is carbon dioxide that we breathe off. And then we all know what H2O is, water, which makes up about 55–60% of a lean adult's total body mass. On top of those, there's also many other salts, acids, and bases we'll talk about. So let's talk about water. Something we've already talked about here this morning. Can be described as the most important and abundant inorganic compound in all living systems. So not even just us, not just fish that live in water, but animals that live in a desert, for example, we're dependent upon water, and it's so important. Without water, we would die in a matter of days, and there are several properties of water that make it indispensable for life. The first is a chemical reactant. So we learned just a little bit ago that reactants are the starting materials in a chemical reaction. We were just talking about hydrolysis and dehydration synthesis reactions, right? Water was a big component in those catabolism, anabolism things that we were talking about just a minute ago. Okay, so it's involved in those. On top of that, we just said that water is a big component of our body, about 55–60%, almost 2/3 of us. We've talked about water being inside our cells, water being between our cells. So when these chemical reactions take place in our body, they're taking place inside of water. So that's what it says, or that's what it means when it says serves as a medium for most chemical reactions in our body. This is where chemical reactions take place. So water is important in that. Water has a high heat capacity, meaning it can absorb or release a relatively large amount of heat with only a modest change in its own temperature. Okay, this is why it can hold heat in, okay, which is helpful for us so that we can like maintain body temperature despite environmental changes, temperature changes, that is. Water has a high heat of vaporization. I was saying it's kind of difficult and it takes a while to boil water, right? Okay, you put that water in a pan, you're gonna make some noodles or something, you boil that water, put the water in the pan, you put the stove on high, it takes 5-10 minutes for your water to boil, right? Does it take very long for the pan that the water's in, that metal pan, to get hot? No, it's almost instantaneous. Okay. Those bonds that I was talking about, the water bonded to other water, like a couple middle schoolers, they're bonded together, they break apart, they come back together. These bonds are constantly breaking and reforming. It takes a lot of energy to officially break them apart. Okay. So that's important to us, especially when we evaporate sweat from our skin, which is the most efficient way to cool our body when we're hot and sweaty. That's why like Under Armour and dry fit clothing is so efficient at keeping you cool compared to like just a cotton t-shirt, because cotton t-shirts get just soaked and then that sweat does not evaporate. When we wear Under Armour and that kind of stuff, it wicks the moisture away, and in doing so just basically pulls the heat from our body, which is cool. Water is a lubricant. It's a major component in our mucus and other lubricating fluids in the body to allow for like internal organs to touch and slide over one another, so no friction occurs. Organs don't, develop holes in them. That would be terrible. Water is a solvent, which is a fancy way to describe the fact that it can dissolve things like salt, as I was talking about, and we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a second. And it's cohesive. It sticks to things. And it sticks together actually. And cohesiveness is important due to the polarity, which allows water to work as a lubricant, as I've already mentioned. So let's talk about water as a solvent a little bit more. So talking about salt, and we've already mentioned, I think Autumn was the one that said you put salt in water, it dissolves, right? Okay. Water does that to a lot of things. Okay. Water can be described as a solvent because it dissolves certain things. The stuff that it dissolves are called solutes. Okay. You've never made Kool-Aid before. Kool-Aid is a simple fluid that we can make and drink. It tastes really nice. It's also super sugary. Okay. There's 3 components to Kool-Aid. Water, which is by far and away the most prominent substance, hopefully anyway. Then you've got, a cup of sugar or whatever it is, and then the flavoring on the package. Okay, you put that all together and you stir it. The sugar and the powder dissolves in the water, so water is the solvent. The sugar and the powdered stuff would be the solutes. Okay. Sweat is another example of a solution in our body, with water being the prominent feature, prominent substance, I should say. So it's a solvent, and there's lots of salts and other stuff in there as well, which are all solutes. And the ability of water to form solutions is essential to health and survival because water can dissolve so many different substances. It's an ideal medium for chemical reactions. Water enables dissolved reactants to collide and form products. Water also dissolves waste products, allowing them to be flushed out of the body in our urine. And it all relates to that opposites attract thing that we've been talking about. Remember, water, because it's not sharing electrons equally ends up with an oxygen that's partially negative. The hydrogens, which are partially positive, well, if you drop a crystal of sodium chloride in there, once again, table salt, look what happens to the sodium. The sodium ions become surrounded by the oxygens of each of those water molecules. Because oxygen is negatively charged, the sodium is positively charged. Opposites attract. The opposite shown down here with chloride becoming surrounded by the partially positive hydrogen atoms. Make sense? So, do all things dissolve in water? No, what's something that will not dissolve in water? Oil. Oil is a form of fat. And we'll talk about that later on in this lecture. Not today, but we will get there, I promise. Okay, let's talk mixtures. Mixture is described as a combination of elements or compounds that are physically blended together but not bound by chemical bonds. So it's a collection of stuff. We don't have, electrons shared, that kind of stuff. 3 common liquid mixtures important in our body are solutions, colloids, and suspensions. First are the most common that we talk about, which are solutions, and it's what we've been talking about. Once mixed together, solutes in a solution remain evenly dispersed among the solvent particles. Okay, if you've ever taken just a cup of water and you put a drop of food coloring in there, you actually can watch the stuff disperse out, and then eventually what you end up with is a cup of red or whatever color food coloring you dropped in there, and no longer can you see the individual particles are just evenly dispersed. You can't just pick them out from one another. And because the solute particles in a solution are very small, you can see right through. And now if you dump the whole deal of food coloring in there, it might be a little harder to see through it, but it's still going to be fairly transparent. Okay. A colloid is different from a solution, and that is because of the size of the particles. The solute particles in a colloid are large enough to scatter light, causing a colloid to usually appear a little bit more translucent or opaque, so it's a little more murky. And there's really only one time we talk about colloids in this class, and that's in the thyroid gland when we form 2 hormones. And really, we don't even talk about it other than just mentioning it's called a colloid. The last one is called a suspension, which is different, and unlike solutions and colloids, in a suspension, the solutes eventually will settle out, and blood is a great example of that, which there's kind of 2 major parts to blood. What we call the formed elements, which is what the cells and fragments of cells are, and then the plasma, which is the liquid portion. Okay. If you were to leave a sample of blood in a test tube and just set it there over a long period of time, what would eventually happen is all those dense cells, like the red blood cells, would separate to the bottom. White blood cells would stick in the middle, and then the plasma, the liquid portion of your blood, would separate to the top. Okay. In labs, they can soup that up and do it within minutes by putting a test tube in a centrifuge, which spins really, 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 really fast, and it helps separate all that stuff. Now, what you end up with at the top is that plasma. Plasma then actually, in its own right, would be an example of a suspension, because there's water and ions and other stuff in the liquid portion, but I won't really get into that at this point. We'll talk a lot more about blood later on in the semester. We'll start with acids and bases on Wednesday.